I did do this at one point, and so I could.
You.
And then I realized that if I
Good, Elliot.
that if I crawled down underneath, I could pretend like I still had hands.
Oh my gosh.
That's so
You
stupid.
wear
I
the
love
same
it.
shirt though.
I know, I was very close, and a different hat.
This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to News from the Real World, where we talk about the top generating posts on the blog this week. My name is Parker. I'm a second-year stage and production management grad student.
Hi, my name is Evan. I'm a first-year scenic design grad.
Hi, I'm Grace. I am a first-year costume design grad.
Hello, I'm Elliot. I am a second-year technical direction grad.
Hi, I'm Izzy. I'm a second-year scenic design grad.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm a third-year sound design grad.
And I have the first article. Oh, no, this is our intro. God damn it.
Popping bottles.
On that note,
Oh, you don't need to clean one where I don't swear? Okay. My first article this week is from NPR. It's titled, "Is It Theater? Chekhov's The Seagull Adaptation for The Sims 4 to Stream on Twitch." It originally appeared on the NPR show All Things Considered as a radio episode, whatever those are called. This story began at the beginning of the pandemic when the New York Theater Workshop realized that they weren't going to be able to mount the season that they had planned and budgeted for. And instead of saving that money, they decided to give it to 27 theater artists to try to reinvent theater for this season. And amongst those was playwright Celine Strong, or Song rather, who adapted The Seagull for The Sims 4 to stream on Twitch. So what that entailed is not any sort of like performers or any of the original of Chekhov's dialogue, but instead she built all of the characters from The Seagull in The Sims and assigned traits to them and things like that, and then like arranges them into rooms together at various points across the Twitch screen and lets them do whatever they want. So the example they give in the article is about two of the characters being left in a room together and getting into an all-out brawl, which is not how The Seagull goes. There's a resonance to the text of The Seagull, which deals in a minor way with the creation of new forms of theater. But I think there's a lot of question about whether this is theater at all and whether this is The Seagull at all. Some of the student comments pointed out that Simlish, which is the language that Sims speak in the Sims video games, is a bad vehicle for the plot density of The Seagull. There's a lot going on, and you're obviously not going to get it all this way. And then I'm going to read the excerpts from one student comment. This is from Victor, who says, so many theaters are trying to figure out how to engage with an audience over the internet, and they're acting like they have to reinvent the wheel. Twitch streamers and YouTubers have already figured out how to build an audience online. The Seagull stream features not only song, but several prominent people in the theater right now. That's in the community should be what we're striving for, not a Brady Bunch style play reading, which I really thought was something that I agree with.
I think it's great. We were talking about some of it earlier, and I brought up Rooster Teeth's Red versus Blue, where they essentially just filmed themselves playing Halo, a video game, and just, dubbed over it. And then, it's been running for 21, 22 seasons now.
It's still going?
Yeah, it's still going.
Wow.
Well, they built an entire media empire around themselves at this point. It's almost, a decade and a half long now since the first episodes came out.
Wow.
I immediately reading this article thought about a thing I came across, and I don't remember if I found it on Facebook or if a friend showed it to me, but Animal Crossing, when it kind of was a big thing at the beginning of the pandemic, someone had created a Hamilton the song Satisfying in Hamilton, like had gone through and created characters that looked like the characters in the show and just played the track, like, and move the characters around the room. And this may be going down the negativity rabbit hole, but I feel like that is not theater. I don't think that we can call that theater the way we have been, because it's the same question when we start talking about Zoom and doing virtual theater and what the unions are arguing about as we speak. It's a huge question, and I think it's very cool, and I think it's an awesome thing to do in this pandemic. And I never want to, like, I think it was awesome. I got so much joy in watching that. But is it theater?
I think for me, it definitively is not the theater and is not Chekhov's The Seagull.
Yeah.
But what I love about it, what I think makes it feel more like a theater event, what I wish that more people were trying to bring to theater events, is this element of community and interactivity, right? Like having a scrolling comment stream makes you feel like you're part of a group of people who are watching something instead of sitting alone in your apartment.
Yeah, I think for me, a benchmark that I have been going off of is, would I have considered this theater before the pandemic? And this is just something I wouldn't. And neither would I really consider Zoom theater as theater. I think I would consider it more of a reading than anything else. But what's kind of cool about this, I think, is that these are areas that never would have been explored if we weren't forced out of the theater building and onto a digital space. And I think will any of this survive after the pandemic and when we return to in-person performance? Probably not, but I think it's kind of ushered in a new age of creative digital thinking that otherwise we would not have gotten. Parker, what you were talking about with Animal Crossing reminds me of the now burgeoning Ratatouille the musical that is existing on TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
Which, again, would that have existed if we weren't in a pandemic? I don't know. Is it theater? Not really. It's a bunch of musical theater nerds creating and writing all these random songs for a hopeful Ratatouille the musical.
Oh my
But
God.
again, it is. I don't think it's theater. But what I do think is it's good for the theater industry. I think it's positive. I think it's encouraging people to look for things that aren't there and helping bring digital media into the theater spaces.
TikTok
It's
also
really-
had that grocery store musical. Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say it's just like entertainment, right? And I think the goal of getting through this pandemic right now is finding ways to escape. And again, I think we have this discussion a lot about like what is Zoom theater, what people are doing theater. But I think when we're talking about all of these other examples, at the end of the day, they're making people happy, and I think they're pushing people creatively. In situations where we can't be doing what we want to be doing together.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that most of the time with theater, the hard part can be like, what does your audience want to see, or getting an audience to show up? So we're living in an interesting time where it's like the audience is dictating the product in a lot of ways. Like if an audience shows up and wants to be on the Sims show and like play around, then it kind of is theater in that way, that you have an audience and you're interacting, and it's kind of changing how we talk about shows to what people want to see. And it puts them in like a more interactive seat, which I think is really good for theater, like moving forward.
Well, I guess speaking of distancing, this is an article titled Professionally Distanced, Ensuring Employee Safety Through Remote Monitoring and Social Distancing, written by Tim Turney on September 1st of 2020. And this is off of the Occupational Health and Safety website. So it's basically just discussing what returning to work safely looks like with COVID being a big problem. And in this article, there was a poll of US employees where 54% said that they still had concerns about exposure to COVID in the workplace. And I think this context isn't necessarily like in a like an office, like 9 to 5 setting. It's more in like places where there are other work risks involved, because they do talk about how not only do they have to consider COVID risk, but they also have to consider the pre-existing risks of working in these workplaces, things that come from injury. They do mention like inhalation of a lot of harmful things like dust, chemicals, fumes. So they bring up this idea of personal monitoring equipment that allows workers to stay distanced but can collect data without disrupting workflow and disrupting like individual people while maintaining distance. And I guess they want to use Bluetooth to collect like this real-time data. And it also, like they're saying that it could also help monitor like other risks in the workplace. So like excessive noise and like vibration levels. So I'm really interested to see what this means. It's really not anything I know a whole lot about, but if it means people, I mean, this sounds like a great use of like providing PPE for people who, may not have the option and have to go back to work. So I'm interested to see where this goes. I want to do more research on it to see how this maybe could expand into more common workplaces, like maybe like an office or schools or uh, theater. So yeah.
This article feels like a weird step closer to some sort of dystopian surveillance state to me.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot. I believe Amazon was already doing this, but not out of the sake of the safety of their employees, but maintaining productivity. And I feel like there's a part of, I don't see this going away. I feel like this is something that's going to start to be implemented. And I think it's great that they're able to start tracking and making sure that employees are practicing social distancing and being safe in the workplace. I've been working on a project calling different entertainment-based companies to see what they're doing. And a lot of them have said that they're taking preventative measures, having employees work in employee bubbles where they're only interacting with the same group of people. But there's always going to be an inherent risk here. And I think monitoring that and tracking that is important. I just hope that it doesn't get to that dystopian point where now everything is monitored. Now you're being monitored for productivity. You're being tracked throughout your day for things not related to your health. And I just, that starts to get a little bit hairy for me.
Yeah.
It's a slippery
Definitely a
slope.
double-edged sword.
Not 1984, this.
Mhm.
We're getting increasingly closer and closer to that. But
Good. I mean, what would this look like in a theater setting?
we had this discussion in class the other day about what the possibilities are when we do return. And currently, the one of the operas is considering doing a performance and on a set that we would need to build, and how would we go about safely loading it in. And I think, it really comes down to proper, like, you can properly plan to ensure remote distancing without necessarily remote tracking. I feel like, again, like a lot of these companies are just making sure that employees are working in bubbles and working in the same group, so that even if there is a problem within a group or somebody does end up transmitting the virus, it's very well contained to just that one pod. But I'd be curious. I feel like we have just so many people often in the theater space at once. It'd be incredibly hard to track. And if you did track it properly, you would get just an absurd amount of connections. That the reality is, tracking is a reactionary response. It's not a proactive response. And I think we need to be taking more proactive responses in our theater if we're going to have any chance of ensuring employee safety.
One of the student commenters also pointed out that a lot of this article seems to be getting at reducing existing hazards and not focusing on the new ones. That seems like it's maybe the wrong tack for some workplaces.
For sure.
I can see the challenge in trying to implement this in theater, but I do think smaller cast size shows have a much better chance of successfully implementing this type of distance. You know, I think about Backstage and how crazy musicals get, and just everybody bumping into everybody, and things change a little bit each night. And some, you know, I mean, I think that type of setting is certainly much more challenging to try and implement this distance versus like a 1 or 2 person show where everybody could have their explicit paths marked out backstage, and there's a lot of ways to be specific about the safety with fewer people.
Well, there's the employee and theater people's aspect of COVID, but there's also the audience aspect of COVID, which brings us to our next article. Events can take place. German scientists present COVID experiment responses. This is written by Gideon Gottfried and centers around a study in Leipzig, Germany, where they simulated a large-scale event and wanted to track and see what happened. Something I found interesting when I started reading this is how much it focused on HVAC systems, and I feel like that's been a large discussion all over the place. I mean, at CMU, they made a very big deal about talking about how they were installing very specific filters and changing those out. It's an interesting article. At first, I was interested to read what the findings were, but there seemed to be a lot left to be desired. There was a fantastic student comment who basically dissected this as a study and kind of broke it down and said there's a lot of, well, we don't entirely know, or, you know, professionals don't entirely know, and there's a lot of, I think this might be the case, or I don't know. The study is promising. It demonstrated that there really wasn't an extraordinarily large spreading of the virus. People were wearing face masks, and most audience members didn't mind wearing the face masks, the article notes. But there is still a lot of unanswered questions here. There was actually a really interesting point also at the bottom of the article that the reality is that most of this isn't even really coming from the science and entertainment world. A lot of it's coming from politicians and their, you know, hesitancy to want to make any of these rash decisions because they're reliant on votes. So at first I was interested. I thought this was going to be a little bit more data driven and a little bit more, you know, here are the steps that you can take that would mimic our experiment to make sure that you're being safe. But unfortunately, I not to say that the article doesn't have good information, but it doesn't really provide a great path forward. It just says focusing on HVAC systems is key. I did appreciate very much so one student's comment about wanting to replace HVAC systems so that it wasn't so cold in the theaters when we walk in the morning. But that's outside of the COVID thing.
How hot that gets with all the lights by the end of the day. Come on, people.
I think what's interesting about this conversation on HVAC is, while I totally agree, what does that look like? You hear a lot of places say advanced HVAC system. And I don't know how much I would feel safe being in an indoor space with a large group of people, even if we are distanced for a long period of time, right? Because it's like a very precise cocktail of things. It's how many people you're around, who's wearing masks, how long you're in the space, if there is any ventilation. And I don't remember the name of the website that I saw it on, but there was this like infographic that showed you if 6 people were gathered in a room, the likelihood of each person getting COVID if one of the people had COVID. And they showed multiple scenarios, like if this person, you know, if the person with COVID isn't wearing a mask, but everyone else is, then almost everyone else is going to get it. And it's like, okay, well, if everyone's wearing masks and they're distanced and they open a window, you know, like there's like a point something % chance that people will get it. So I think while people will talk about advanced HVAC, I think it's just sort of accepting that it's not going to be safe until there's a vaccine, and whether or not you want to risk that.
Well, having a huge crowd is such a risk. I mean, the thing is that I think the current understanding of the coronavirus is that most people only give it to one or two other people when they have it. And then there's the super spreaders, right, who give it to a lot of people. So if you have a crowd and you have one person singing and they happen to be a super spreader, that's a huge recipe for disaster, right? Even with masks, even with HVAC. So it does seem like despite the optimistic title, I don't think I'm going to write to all my favorite theater companies and say, it's fine, you can come out of the woods now. It's I think there's still some time before we'll be in rooms like that in America.
I really do also. It's unfortunate in many ways. I feel like we didn't quite have the understanding at the time, but outdoor theater really seemed to be a promising way of still performing in a very safe and socially distant manner. Unfortunately, there were just so many regulations placed. I know Actors Equity, justifiably at some points, but was very, very strict about how to go about safely producing theater. And the unfortunate reality is I feel like now we're hoping, if we wanted to do outside theater, we can start to implement that. But now we're going into the winter season and outdoor theater is less viable than it was before. And
it's in half the country. I'm sure that outdoor theater can happen in more of the warmer states down south or over on the West Coast.
Yeah, that's the hope. There was a summer stock that I worked at that did their entire summer season. This summer, and did not have any problems. They got approval from the state. They got approval from the former health advisor under the Obama administration. Said that you're doing it as good of a job as anything. And but they were still also blacklisted by Actors Equity because it wasn't their guidelines.
Well, and I think that I think what we do is important, but I still think that one death is too many.
Absolutely, yeah.
Like I couldn't conscience that as a theater director or artistic director or whatever.
Yeah, and I wonder how HVAC deals with the anxiety, COVID anxiety, because that's a big thing too for audiences. It's it's great that HVAC has been so successful, but also it's not a very visual, tangible thing for the audience. So if they're not seeing an insane amount of stepping blocks in the way to make them feel safe, even if they're trivial things like standing in a circle or something, it might deter audience members from showing up just because they can't tell physically if they're safe or not. They just have to trust the organization that they're being truthful and transparent.
I think what's something that is really cool and actually is something extraordinarily possible is in the article they have a great photo of the airflow simulation where they actually just use smoke machines and hazers and turn them on to show how the HVAC system was distributing and moving the air around the space. And that's something that we could do now. That's something you could go into the Chosky, you could grab all of our machines, turn them on, and see what happens and make calculated decisions from there. And that's something that I think, to Izzy's point, I think you're absolutely right. We can't see air, but if we have a well-documented experiment where we say, hey, look, I know you can't see it happening, but this is what the air system is doing when you're actually sitting in the theater, could at least, when it comes to HVAC systems, alleviate some of that anxiety. Again, is that anxiety going to go away without a vaccine? I don't think so. I don't know, but it's still pretty interesting.
Yeah, I don't know.
Based on how fogged up the theaters get at the end of playground, I don't know how much I trust our HVAC systems.
Well, but also I don't think that haze is a perfect one-to-one for coronavirus droplets, right? It's you're saying, I mean, you can see what airflow is doing, of course, but it's here's what would happen if coronavirus was all over a room, not if one person was coughing in the third row.
And I think that ultimately getting back to the article too, I think most of what they found too is that most audience members had a very limited, even though there were many people in the audience, they only interacted with a handful of the people that they were surrounded by. And as long as you're not constantly shifting around, speed dating with every member of the audience, the risk of transmission is not equivalent to how does this haze spread throughout a building. Because sitting in PTM during, playground, you realize, wow, the ventilation system in the Purnell Center is kind of spreading haze everywhere in this building. So I agree, Evan, that I don't think it's a great indicator, but part of it too is, again, alleviating anxiety. You almost hate to say that science and you can give all the science you want, but people are still going to be anxious because they can't see it. But if showing that haze, like, even though realistically it doesn't have that much of an impact, but demonstrating how the airflow system works can just alleviate that anxiety from audience members and hopefully encourage them to come to the theater again when it's safe to do so, when there's a vaccine.
And as a student commenter pointed out, there's a trust that you have to, I mean, the entire audience and the examples on their best behavior.
Exactly.
And
There's also probably a little bit of like survey bias in this experiment as well. But hopefully I think people that want to go to a theater are going to be cognizant of that bias themselves. Like if you're actively going to a theater to see a show, you're going to want to make sure that you're on your best behavior and making sure that you're properly distancing and following guidelines.
It's exciting to start talking about ways that we can actually do theater in a real space.
Yeah.
This next article gives another great example of some new things coming up in industry right now. On the Los Angeles Times, what is a COVID-19 compliance supervisor and what to know about Hollywood's newest job? I found this article very interesting. This new term, the COVID-19 supervisor, came from the union disputes that we were talking about earlier. We've talked about before. It's this position that there are already webinars out that you can start getting training in to become a COVID compliance supervisor on a production. Your roles are sanitization, testing safety equipment, making sure the space is clean and ready, training new members as they join the team as to what sort of things are acceptable in the rehearsal room in terms of COVID. Training others around. It's really the person centralized in cleaning the spaces and keeping everyone up to date with the COVID-19 rules. Immediately where I went to with this as a stage manager is I am so happy, because without this role of a specific person to do this job, it would have most definitely fallen onto stage management. And I think stage managers are very capable, and I think we would have done a great job, but that's just another level of thing added to our plate, and it's a serious issue. It's something that should be devoted as much time as possible, and it's incredible that we're talking about having a single person in charge of that. I think that's the way to make this the most effective implementation of a new role, instead of spreading other people more thin. But yeah, it was a great article, very simple, kind of just went through the details of what this role is expected, and went through several different scientists are offering training. It's coming from people outside of the theater industry that are training people with theater experience to kind of take on these roles. Yeah.
I couldn't stop thinking about you, Farker. When I read this article, I was just like, oh, this must make me so happy, because you're right. Like, I've always felt that so much just gets thrown towards a stage manager because they're seen as the authority figure in the rehearsal and performance spaces. And I remember working on one of my first professional LORT equity productions, looking at the stage managers, just documentation for everything. I'm like, there's so much here that they're responsible for figuring out that I can't begin to imagine. And my hope is that this starts to kind of usher in continuous support for health and safety in the rehearsal spaces and performance spaces. We saw this with intimacy direction. That was a need that needed to be filled that could not be filled in the rehearsal space and should not have been dealt with by stage management, because that shouldn't have been their responsibility. And I hope that this doesn't go away. I feel like we could benefit from having just a general health and safety advisor per production. My dad and I have had many conversations about, with COVID, there was always the draw of comparison between the COVID and the flu. And the thing that I've always thought is we shouldn't accept the flu killing 60,000 people a year either. Death is bad, and we should do everything we can prevent it. And I think as theater makers, having a just health advisor and health safety officer could be extraordinarily helpful to just maintain a healthy, safe working environment.
I was going to ask if you guys thought that after there's a vaccine and all of this dies down, if somebody would keep doing that position, and it would just kind of turn into this umbrella health and safety supervisor, making sure things are clean and sanitary for actors and everyone else in the dressing room and the green rooms, making sure that props are cleaned, or if somebody gets sick, that gets taken care of.
I mean, you think about prop food and drink, and you think about how often that can just get passed around a stage or all that stuff. And props supervisors and managers often do take precautions when it comes to that, but I think having, again, somebody that isn't just limited to the rehearsal space, but the entire production process is really crucial.
It's like having your health and safety inspectors, right? At
Exactly.
restaurants and stuff. But what I'm hoping comes out of this with just this title and this position is maybe something, funded at a federal level. I'm thinking about like schools, like all of those kids who have been sent back to school and have been sent back home now. I think in Pennsylvania, there are a couple schools where there, have been staff members that have tested positive for COVID, and now all the kids have to go back home. And what does that mean? This back and forth. And I think this could also be implemented. Of course, it's harder because when you've got public programs such as school, the money isn't there, right? But that's why Hollywood's able to do it, because they have the money to, make sure that they can keep producing work and going back to work. But yeah, the first thing I thought of was school, because, and also like at the collegiate level, because they're just petri dishes, right? That's what everyone says. Dorms, there should be like some sort of health supervisor for like, co-ed living, something like that.
I immediately started thinking about how we used to do things right in rehearsal, and especially in terms of props. If somebody drank out of a cup, we would alcohol swab it at the end of the night, and make sure if anyone was using the props for food or drink, we would wipe down and make sure they were sanitized. But those were the only ones we cared about. Thinking back to it, a wand or something simple, that's touched by 6 different people a night isn't sanitized for the entire run of the production. And that's like kind of crazy to look back on, thinking about things that way. And with 2019 or with COVID-19 eyes, like looking back on it.
Even something as small as, I know in smaller regional theaters, when you have microphones in musicals, oftentimes they get passed from performer to performer.
Yeah.
And I don't think I've ever worked in a theatrical environment where that was sanitized from performer to performer. It just was handed off, and
Or even
it
night
just
to
kind
night,
of, everyone
even if
just
they
kind of rolled with the
sweat.
punches. And yeah, like now again, I feel like, I mean, there are many aspects of our industries that we have always relied on somebody picking up the slack and picking up the slack for something that maybe they shouldn't be responsible for. And now we're starting to peel it back and say, okay, like we need to start thinking about who should be in charge of this and create, and not be afraid of creating positions when we need somebody there.
Definitely.
So kind of shifting to a more like legal aspect of theater right now is this article about a Russian musical casting spotlight on international copyright concerns. And it's a show through Broadway Moscow Theater Company called Lover's Day. And it was designed to attract theatergoers who loved First Date, the musical, the Broadway musical, that they had previously in their season. And when they produced the show, it was met with such rave reviews and everybody loved it that they thought, oh, well, wouldn't it be interesting if we wrote our own version of it? And so they did. And they put on a show that focused on a pair of lovers who fell in love at their first date and are now planning their wedding. And the lead producer was aiming to make a music, or claimed that they made a musical no worse and, in his opinion, better than the American musical First Date. And his audience loved it. And they said that what they loved about it was that it was everything they were missing when they saw First Date, because First Date was from a Western audience dealing with Western issues, whereas this one was about like a Russian couple and the issues that they were facing. And it was so much more romantic and enjoyable for their audience because they related and saw themselves in the character. And although the plot was set up as a sequel, they were not claiming it to be the sequel. It was not advertised as a sequel to First Date. First Date wasn't anywhere in their campaign to promote the show. But they did not have permission to make a sequel to the Broadway musical hit and received a cease and desist letter in August. And Russian Broadway Moscow Theater Company, they basically decided, okay, well, we're just gonna slightly change it so that it's less like a sequel, but we're gonna keep the whole plot. They changed the characters, and they, in their like address to the public, they said it has different characters, different text, different set design, and none of the copyright elements are present from First Date. And so they made a revised version and kept going on with it. And the article basically ends saying that describing the different copyright laws for writers in America, and they're protected overseas. And so they absolutely could try and sue Moscow Theater Company, but that it's going to be a long and expensive process, and most likely they're never going to pursue legal action. And the most interesting thing for me just reading through it was thinking about like the tension between, like, as a theater artist, wanting your work to be protected because it's so hard to have ownership over your work, but then also the greater question of, well, they didn't steal the work, and I want people to be able to see themselves represented and to, like, have their own narrative. And that's what's great about theater, is it can transform and change and has different perspectives in it. And so I don't really know what I think about the article. It's just something really interesting to think about.
Well,
I'm
first
trying to
off,
think.
America's classic musical First Date. How could we? I'm.
But also, it's
how
also
dare
funny
they?
because, well, First Date is also really interesting because it's not like the standard composer writing the entire show. This show's like famous for having like dozens of contributors, kind of like the SpongeBob musical.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, I don't. Okay, so I guess, like, if you look at it for what it is, I don't think it's great that they were like, let's just, like, this, we don't think it's that good. Let's make it better. And to be like upfront about that and then to do it. But again, like, so that's not good. But, they created something that like their audiences really loved and enjoyed, which is great. And I'm all about making people feel connected to others through art. Again, though, like First Date the musical, the American hit, I just find it very funny that, like, interesting that, like, Russian audiences were like, this is what we love out of American musical theater.
I was trying to think about, because it seems like the thing that is stopping anyone from litigating is the fact that they're in a different country, miles and miles away. And I was trying to think about how we would all feel if someone did that with a recent Broadway hit on Broadway. It was like, here's the Angelica Schuyler rapping musical, or whatever.
The British perspective of the
Right.
American Revolution.
Exactly, yeah. Whatever it is, I think that we would. I think it's complicated. I think it's really hard to say that something like that is directly a sequel.
Right. I mean, I think at the end of the day, copyright and all this is set up to make sure that people that deserve compensation for their work get that compensation. And I mean, the question of, in this case, is like, could you have had Lover's Day without First Date? And like, the answer is no.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to be paying both respect and money to the people that gave you that story to begin with. And
But a lot of work, especially musical theater, is derivative, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, most musical theater is based on something. Very few
I think
different stories.
then a lot of people have to keep paying, like, the Beatles a lot of money because of how influential they are, just in, like, the growth of, musicians during that time period, who then went on to create a bunch of music. So I think, that argument is a little flawed, because I think at the base of it, and the article kind of hits on it, where, yeah, it's the kind of like idea of First Date, but it's different in that it's a different audience. It's for a different audience. It's, their values, their kind of customs and idioms when it comes to First Date and relationships and all these kinds of things. So yeah, inspired by, sure, maybe not even really a direct sequel, but it is different wholly in and of itself, I think.
Well, they had to change it though. There's that like month period where they like got the cease and desist, and then we're like, now change the show.
The threat of legal action will spur you to do a lot.
Right. Well, I wonder how much can you actually change about a show in a month? I mean,
quite a bit.
There was actually, I mean, there's similar instance with the last 5 years when Jason Robert Brown actually got a very similar cease and desist from his ex-wife, because that story was written about his relationship with his ex-wife, and he used a lot of information from that
Mhm.
you know, from their shared relationship. And she basically said, I don't want you using me and not have my permission to do so, and had to very similarly change a lot about the musical to avoid that legal issue. So it's not the first time this has happened, but it is curious. I don't know what I would do if I
Yeah,
ever.
and I think in terms of like these gray areas of what you can copyright as an artist, I think a lot about that article we read about the tattoos and the video games, and the tattoo artist, you know, took legal action because that was her work being, you know, and I think like the thing I think a lot about in terms of theater is um we have like, you know, they Broadway opens up with this new musical and it's a hit. And, you know, once the rights come out, every high school, every small theater, regional theater is doing it around the country. And the designs are often very much mimicked, or at least take direct, like, in quote unquote inspiration from that. And so, you know, like in a way, you have these designers who've created iconic imagery that's been used for decades. And, you know, where can you draw the line there about what is sort of stealing and profiting off of another artist's work?
How many Lort theaters and colleges and high schools have done the original choreography to West Side Story? Like if you do West Side Story, you do that choreography.
Or chorus line, or like anything. Like
Sometimes you don't even have a choice though. Sometimes that's actually licensed in the agreement that like
Yeah.
you have to use this choreography. It is part of you agreeing to do the show. So
A sort of funny opposite example is Peter and the Starcatcher. If you all know that show, the movement design of the Broadway production is not part of what's licensed, and it's in the contract. You cannot reproduce anything that they did with the movement of the original Broadway production when you do that show. You're not supposed to.
correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Curious Incident is the same way because of all the
I
movement.
haven't done Curious Incident. I've just done Peter. But that would make sense. I think it's actually the same movement choreographer for both of those. That would be interesting.
Yeah. So I guess you know, like and I think that's unique because those are much newer plays, but I'm just thinking about like how many of the same Les Mises have we seen? Like same costume, like what's his name? The guy who dies with the red vest, like he's
Almost a raw.
always
in a
the red vest.
Mhm.
So
and God forbid, I remember when the 2013 revival of Les Mis happened and they didn't use a turntable and everyone was like, "Huh, what are you gonna do?" It's like, yeah, it's so hard. It's so hard to figure it out. It's not black and white. It's not like, oh, this is like Hannah, what you were saying is it's like you're absolutely right. Like where is the line? And the reality is there is not, I don't think, a clear line when it comes to anything. And it's, you know, I think oftentimes people do have the best of intentions of going into these situations and don't intend to just like outright steal and try to profit off of something else. I think even in this case with First Date, I don't think the goal was to say, you know, we're gonna just steal this idea just for the sake of steal. Like they were like, no, like we want to make this relevant to our audience members, and we want to build off of a story that's already there. It's crazy.
Yeah,
it's just like Shakespeare. Sorry.
and I think that if they like part of the issue with the Moscow Theater Company was just like the publicity of the process and like how transparent they were being, because like if they went into their little writer's hole for 6 months and then they came out like 6 months after they did First Date and were like, we wrote a new musical that is inspired by but completely different, that would be one thing. But the way that the article reads, at least the way that the author wrote it, it's very much like, oh, a couple months after First Date, we said, we're going to do this, but better. And ours is better. And like, it's completely different. Don't worry about it. And they like weren't even trying to make it sound like it was an original piece. It was more of like a rewrite for their country.
It's totally the sequel culture thing, right? Like you want people who liked First Date to come see it.
Mhm.
You know?
Well, talking about something that is certainly not a sequel, well, maybe you can say it's derived off of human beings.
That
Disney
was a
made.
stretch.
Disney
I
made.
applaud
I don't
that
know how you want to try to transition between copyright law and robots that can realistically stare into your soul.
I don't. I just.
Written by Andrew Lisowitsky, and so Disney's made a robot that has taken a step further into creating realistic animatronics that reacts much more to the environment to simulate human behavior. One of the things that it talks about a lot is about how.
Thank you. Take it off the screen.
Yeah, there you go. How much human interaction and how humans behave is based off of subtleties. And it's one of the most telling ways to say that's not real. Like that, it's one of those subtle things in the back of our minds that we look at something and say something's off about that, such as just the very subtle movements you make just because you're breathing and rocking up and down. But anyway, so Disney has created this robot and developing this robot to feel more lifelike. Despite lacking, skin or any other human features, it does have eyes that it does look really kind of creepy. And I would say that many of the students agreed that commented on this article, especially just the fact that it was lacking skin. Like they decided to just go ahead and try this out, and they were like, we're good with the eyes and the eyelids. And it certainly is creepy. There's a lot about why is this necessary? Why do we need to do this? I had even commented on this article, talking about you were so concerned whether or not you could do something that you never stopped to ask yourself whether or not you should. It's to me, this is inevitable. Robots that are going to look like humans, it's just going to happen. Somebody out there is going to develop it. Why it had to be Disney is kind of curious to me. Like why Disney was the one that said, we're going to spearhead this. I get animatronics, and some of their animatronics of like Disney princesses based off of the cartoon versions are phenomenal. And I can see that having a really cool, that can be really cool to interact with, because obviously Disney is about the immersive environment. And if like that's another step further into saying we're taking you into the cartoon world, and that's just something that is almost unheard of and almost impossible to imagine experiencing. But at the same time, this is taking it almost a step towards, why are you trying to realistically make it a human person? And like I even went so far to say, is just like, are we that averse to wanting to interact with other people, or dare I say hire an actor to perform a part at a Disney park? I don't know, that just seemed to be like, why are you investing all this time and resources into this when, I don't know.
Yeah, the article spends no time talking about application. It's like they made it, it's here.
Like, cool,
like, we've all waiting for it.
Why?
Right.
It immediately goes to Disney World as seen through Westworld, and like going to a Disney park and like forget about all the actor and artist like opportunities in Disney, like going in and every princess looks exactly like the cartoon in real life because they're a robot. Like, what is the application, and is it necessary? It reminds me of how I get frustrated at grocery stores when it's all self-checkout and there's only one cashier. And I'm like, no, these are people's jobs. I'm okay with talking to somebody for 30 seconds while I get my groceries bagged. I feel like it doesn't have a lot of benefit for individuals. It just seems like a monetary benefit for a large corporation.
I mean,
Like,
they're probably
again,
going to try to weaponize them, right? That's like
Of
the plot
course.
of everything. It's like Blade Runner, right?
He does look like Go-Go Gadget.
Yeah.
Like
So-
pretty soon we're going to be like, I don't remember what they're called in Blade Runner, but they're going to be like,
Replicas.
you-
Replicants, yeah.
are you replica or?
The one thing I will say though that I found positive about this is me interpreting this. They didn't talk about this at all in the article, but like for me, I could see this being extraordinarily impactful in the medical world and when it comes to prosthetics, because I think we've come so far in providing prosthetics for people who need it, but there's always just a certain level of inhumanity that you notice. And I feel like with this technology, this kind of adaptive technology that it takes in the environment, incorporate that with the just exponential growth in interest in machine learning and artificial intelligence, you can create such realistic prosthetics that would just break down barriers for those people that rely on prosthetics to function in their daily lives. Again, this isn't the medical world though. This is the entertainment
But
world.
why Disney? Like,
Why
because of the
Disney?
body monitoring. This is how they're trying to make sure those college interns are selling those pretzels and not on their phones.
because
I
I think
have a
But like, is it cheap? Like, honestly, how much time and energy and money has been dumped into this project versus how much money does it
See, I
cost to
wasn't-
hire somebody?
did they go hire new people who, like, I know they have people
It's
working with
probably
like
just their
robotics
Imagineers, right?
and engineers, but like, did they go find like genius people to go do this and like create a whole new area for this, or do they have these people? Like, I think about what's happening with Google, where they're like, okay, calm down, like you're taking over everything. You need to separate. Like, I feel like Disney is in that world where it's like, well, why don't they just start a sister company or something, or like have somebody else? It just
they
is so weird that it's like, look at what Disney's doing when it doesn't seem Disney related.
I mean,
Yeah, well, in the
it's
Disney parks-
adjacent, I guess. Sorry, Evan, you can go ahead.
Thank you. In the Disney parks, they have they certainly have the animatronics, and there's that new Star Wars ride in one of them that has like these very fluid movements. So they clearly are trying to push forward what animatronics can do.
Yeah.
I
Like, I can see stormtroopers, absolutely. Like, but they don't have eyes.
I didn't.
right.
Yet.
I have
I
the
still
article.
wouldn't want to see stormtroopers just like coming down at me, robot
They're, like,
stormtroopers.
open.
Mm-hmm. No, it's creepy. I have the article open on. I have two monitors, and so it's been staring at me this whole time. And I did not realize that
God.
the image at the top of the article is a GIF until it blinked at me.
God.
No.
They wanted so Disney just really needs, like, they just are trying to update that Jack Sparrow animatronic.
They really are.
That's what I went to. I didn't think initially about replacing actors, but updating like Pirates of the Caribbean and It's a Small World and how it would change that look. But those are such classic rides. Why would you want to do that? You know,
Yeah.
why
And
would you
at
spend
what
that money?
point, like, do you need that realistic of a robot if you know
Right.
you're riding on a ride and the robot is however many feet away from you? And
Yeah, well,
It-
and as a
It
student
has
comic
to
book
be
pointed
a
out,
being, if that's a problem.
what?
What?
They're a human being.
Has to be a being.
just
How many people are dying to be Jack Sparrow? I mean, I'm
Honestly.
sure.
Too many people.
Johnny Depp is probably still dying to be Jack
Oh,
Sparrow. Let's be real
He
here.
did it in the ride.
The latest Pirates movie was a disaster.
Well, so speaking of flesh or lack thereof,
Oh.
Thank you for helping me out here. I was like, how do I get this backtracked? So this is an article in Dance Magazine by Faith Joy Desire. Unclear. Sorry for butchering names. Where she talks about her first experience joining the ballet theater group of Dance Theater of Harlem Summer Intensive for Ballet, where for her first time in her life, they didn't want everyone to wear the pink ballet tights that are so ubiquitous, around the world in ballet, but they wanted you to get your skin tone. It was like, no, go downstairs, buy your tights in your skin color. And it's actually a really nice article about her emotions and her feelings of, for the first time, looking in the mirror in the dance hall and seeing her skin tone from head to toe all the way across her body and what that kind of meant and how that made her feel. And I think it's really, really, really sweet.
It's super sweet.
And just like that kind of experience of like how, I mean, as white people, we don't really like think about these things because there's this mentality that white is the default wrongly in most in these things, but like that kind of experience, I just can't imagine.
Yeah, and
I
how that
understand.
lends itself to other areas. Like, I think of makeup a lot. If you've ever had to take a stage makeup class and had to buy that Ben Nye kit, they don't make a kit that matches my skin tone at a very like, and it's like, I would still have an easier time. There's no nuance and there's no like attention to that detail of the complexity of the colors that are in everyone's skin tones. And I think you go to a lot of costume shops, especially. What I think maybe also a lot of people don't realize is how hard it is just to find underwear in people's skin tones. So often, like, I've had to buy lots of underwear and then take skin tone swatches and then have a very skilled craftsperson dye it to that skin tone. And it's like, if you think about the work that we're putting into just making sure that this person has something that looks like it was supposed to be for them. I think, it makes a huge difference, is just acknowledging someone's existence. Like, you have the right to be the way you are in this space.
I was interested to see one of the student comments mention experience that I thought was a white people experience. Well, in my life, it was that it wasn't until I got to college that someone pointed out to me that Band-Aids are supposed to be flesh tone. I just never had even thought about it. And there's a student commenter, Apriya, who mentioned having the same experience as a Black person, not knowing that they were supposed to be skin tone her whole life. So it sort of shows how ubiquitous that dominance is.
I don't know. I always get the colored, like, fancy
The cartoon ones.
characters on them, like cartoon characters.
Paw-
for my
Paw Patrol.
Band-Aids. Yeah. So I never wanted mine to be skin flesh toned.
Yeah, I'm curious if this is like a change that's going to spread throughout ballet, not specifically for tights, but like just the individual, because a lot of times like dance, or like I think of like cheerleader teams or like POMs, gymnastics, the whole thing is that you're a collective and your individuality like doesn't matter. Like if you know about ballet and you go to the ballet, you're going to like appreciate, the artists that you're there for. But for the general audience, like what makes it so seamless is that they're a collective. And so I think that's part of what the tights were doing, was like, any difference any of you have, we're going to like try to make it look the same. But now people are starting to realize like the beauty of the individual and how people identify with individuals, because we are individuals. So I'm hoping that that's something that they like take even further, and like they can find ways to make it beautiful to see differences instead of striving to see the same.
A lot of theatrical, or meant for stage and stuff, companies that produce things like tights, point shoes, underwear, dance and character shoes, have expanded their colors. So while there still isn't, maybe the range that there could be, at least they're taking that into consideration. And what you were saying, Izzy, about that seamlessness of everyone looking the same, it's like, well, then why have we chosen the standard to be the white person if that is the thing that they are repeating? So and you see it a lot too with I think it's Rihanna's lingerie line. You have not just lingerie that's in multiple skin tones, and also her makeup too, right? But for body types, etc. So there really is this huge inclusive nature that a lot of companies are embracing when it comes to just inclusivity with skin color and maybe like hair type, body type, all that stuff. And yeah.
Well, talking about representing individuality in art, the next article discusses how lacking diversity in Hollywood could actually end up losing money. Talk about how people want to see that level of individuality.
Yeah, so this article on Deadline, the new study finds Hollywood studios could lose money from movies that lack diversity. I was immediately pulled in when I saw this title, and I was excited to read more. So this is by Dina Ray Ramos from October 6th of this year. And it was a study of 109 movies that premiered from 2016 to 2019. So that's kind of the study that was done. And they found that movies with authentic diversity included and represented accurately in their films did about $130 million better in the box office, which is a large sum. And it is very cool to read an article that gives tangible evidence and a tangible reason for the people at the top of these chains who are making these decisions about money on why, hey, maybe you can make money and do the right thing at the same time. So it's exciting. They came up with this, they call it AIR, which is authentically inclusive representation. It's like a number that they came up with for each of the films based on their level of inclusivity. And they found a high correlation between that AIR number that the study came up with and Rotten Tomatoes, which is like a standard rating system for these films. They also came up with several recommendations about setting your casting net far and wide, try and get as much inclusivity in the writing team as well. So that way, you know, things that we all talk about in theater, but this point kind of, yeah, that's pretty much it. It was very simple. It was straightforward. It was the numbers.
Yeah, I kind of, well, I have two thoughts of like how important those kind of things are. My roommate is Hispanic, and I think probably at least once a month he'll go back and rewatch Coco all the time. But that comment about diversity in the writing room, I think that is so important for these characters because it helps the characters. It helps that realistic inclusion with these characters, like going back to the American musical First Date and its Russian counterpart sequel. How much more writing to what they knew and would see and experience culturally in romance made that story and those characters so much more appealing, and there's that connection you can get to these characters.
It also like creates this level of authenticity. I think that feels just very genuine. And I don't mean into like cultural authenticity, but just something that's a little more down to earth and doesn't feel like it's trying as hard. I think a lot about, and I don't know if any of you have seen She-Ra, the new Netflix series.
Yes, I love
But
it. It's
yeah,
so good.
and you know, I watched it for the first time and you're sort of like, wow, it's like they're not trying very hard, but like, and like almost everyone who voices a character is a person of color or someone who is, you know, gender nonconforming, non-binary, you know, just basically they're just like, whatever, we'll just get who we want to do it rather than say that like, this is a such and such character that needs to be, you know, voiced, or, you know, we just want this famous like white actor to do it. Where, you know, and I think there's something just so honest about creating work like that. And I think hopefully more like, you know, film companies and TV shows will recognize that it's not hard to do it, and you can create some really, you know, beautiful inclusive work too.
Yes, lesbian kiss on kids television.
I know it's not even like, and again too, when you actually do the thing, you're not baiting anyone, right? It's not like pushing like, oh yeah, like we might be diverse, but you don't really know.
I think there's just
and one of the things I think this points out is that all those Hollywood producers, or like the cliche I have in my mind of Hollywood producers who are like, but the money, it's just about the money. No one cares about, you know, white people buy white movies or whatever it is. It just shows that what they're upholding is not a reality.
right.
You know,
Like you can pretend all you want
and beat them up with it.
Yeah. We had this discussion in our anti-racist theater class about producing a musical that was not, like, you kind of more or less knew wasn't going to be profitable. And why, and a question that came up, at least in our small group discussion, was why is it all of a sudden a question when it's like talking about a black story or like talking about a diverse experience, that money now becomes an option. There are plenty of movies, there are plenty of TV shows, and there are plenty of Broadway plays, musicals that are produced wholeheartedly knowing that it probably will not make money. But that becomes a discussion when it's about like BIPOC stories of like, oh, well, we can't justify it because it doesn't have the money. And I think, again, it's starting to prove that that's just a mirage that has been put up that is not true. People want to hear these stories. People want to learn. I think you look at like Coco, for example, was just an unbelievable smash hit. And I know for me, having never really studied or learned about this culture, I was just enamored by it. And I found the story so beautiful and compelling. And I think that's just something that you can find across the board. I think people want to learn about these different cultures. People are so curious because it's like learning about and reading a story that's been written for thousands of years. And it's so rich with history and so unbelievably dense and well thought out and just beautiful. And people want to learn that and people want to look that way. But for whatever reason, people are hesitant to do that and take those risks.
Because, you know, they want to keep their power, right? And I think
Exactly.
a perfect opposite example of Coco is the new Mulan that did not do very well. And I think that's where they totally just missed the target, right?
Right.
They had everything they needed to do a good job. And I think that's an example of how a lot of theater companies or films will do stories about BIPOC, but then you see who's behind the scenes and they're all white. So
Right. Yeah.
I did
And I
hear
think
all this
it's another
time.
challenge that we need to be doing ourselves. I think there's a lot of conversation right now is talking about the artists, and as rightfully they should be talking about them. And I've been seeing Playbill talk about Black producers and BIPOC producers. But there's also growing problems, especially, I mean, among this group of people on the production and design side that is often not talked about and left on the table, and I think needs to be brought up.
I will also make sure to mention in the article, this diversity number, the AIR number that they came up with, included the diversity of the tech staff and the behind the scenes people.
Yeah. And I think we read an article way earlier in the semester about how the Oscars are now, the Academy is now requiring, there's like levels, they give them like graded levels, like A, B, C, sort of on terms of like the diversity of like this kind of story they're telling, who is like directing, producing, the creative team, who is actually on the crew, and all this stuff. And I think I hope this thing catches on, because it's like the Bechdel test, right? Like we use that as like to gauge, you know,
Explain for our audience who might not know what the Bechdel test is.
the Bechdel test is named after Alison Bechdel, right? And it's about it. The test is if there's like a scene, and I think it came from film, but a scene where you have two female characters who talk for like more than 5 minutes and don't mention like and aren't talking about like another male character. And I
Naming
think
female characters.
yes. So, very few films do this, which is incredibly astounding. You would think it wouldn't be that
Yeah.
hard, but
There's three rules. The first one is there must be more than one named woman in the cast. The two women must interact with each other more than once, and they must not only converse about the main lead or other men.
And it's become a litmus test for not individual movies, but for the industry as a whole. You say this year of the Oscar-nominated movies, only this many passed the Bechdel test. You don't say this movie is bad because it doesn't pass the Bechdel test.
Mhm.
And then Alison Bechdel intended it to be, in collaboration with somebody else, I believe, intended it to be a condemnation of the ability for females to appear on screen and have like homosocial contact. It was about the expression of queer women originally, but it has been taken as a more feminist, broad idea since.
Well, speaking of money and systemic oppression, the next article is called Elsa Hiltner Advocates for Transparency in Theater Design Salaries. And I am so excited about this article because I'm wildly upset and frustrated and full of fire over this topic, because we don't have any salary transparency. It's like nobody wants to talk about how much money they make, which is why there's such unequal pay. Like, you can't advocate for how much you think you're worth because you don't know how much other people are being paid, and like your worth is just decided out of thin air. And so the article is talking about, it starts with Theater Communications Group has announced that their job search engine Art Search is not only free, is going to be free to all users, but it will additionally require all prospective employers to list a salary range for their postings. And this is like one of the first steps towards systemic changes within the theater industry, aiming at dismantling inequality and financial exploitation. Thank goodness. And there's this quote in here that like, it hurts, but it's so good. And it says, who wants to admit that their expensive MFA in directing earned them a plum position at the top theaters in the city, only to earn less than a mid-level manager at the local McDonald's? Ouch.
Woof.
And it goes into the individual Elsa Hiltner, who is a freelance costume designer and wardrobe stylist with 16 years of experience in and out of Chicago. And she first came into the news when she wrote a viral essay for Howl Round called A Call for Equal Support in Theater Design. And then later, and this is very prevalent to a lot of things going on right now during COVID, she created a theatrical designer pay resource spreadsheet. And when it was first introduced, people like were offended by it and felt uncomfortable sharing their information. And the concept was like, you could leave your name out, but you put like the position, you could put the theater you're working at, how many hours a week you're working, et cetera, your background experience, your race, whatever. And then you would put in your salary or how much you're being paid. And the whole point was, let's all be transparent so we can point out the systemic oppression and the flaws and the exploitation in the industry.
The only one who wins when we don't talk about our pay is the employers.
Exactly. And it doesn't make sense because like there's so many more employees, like we have the power to change it. And she basically talks about how all of her time in school, she never really got any experience with business, and she was always really interested in it. And so as she got all the experience, she started being more interested in the business side of things, which pushed her to start being more transparent. And one last thing to like point out that she talks about is that the money in theater always seems to be there, and it's very arbitrary. Like, so she points out, okay, so if you run out of raw materials such as paint, and you go over budget on paint, and you go to the theater and say, your show won't open unless we have 50 more gallons of paint, there's always the money for 50 more gallons of paint. And she exposes that theater always seems to be willing to shovel out the money for things that they can show the audience, be like, here you go, this is what the money went to. But when it comes to the artists and actors, and she recognizes in here that actors have the same exact issues. But when it comes to the people backing the creation, there's not the same flexibility. And they're like, oh, well, what's the money really going towards? And the article just kind of ends, like, it doesn't really have any sort of conclusion, but it's just like an open statement about how we need to be transparent and point out the flaws in our financial society.
I love that as costume designer is leading this fight, because I think of the, like, when you think of the main like top design positions, costume designers are always up there, but they are given the least amount of respect and support amongst those positions, probably second only to prop designers. I want to show you guys the spreadsheet she's talking about, because you can see what crazy amount of information it is here, all different cities in the bottom. And then for each theater, people self-report the job, what they were paid. And it's really useful to be able to see how that changes, different size show, different size budget, but still, when you get hired somewhere, you can go check what other people have been paid, and instead of trying to guess how poor or rich the theater company is.
Not having conversations about payment only benefits employers. Like,
yeah,
it's this fallacy that it's taboo to talk about your payment because it's just been ingrained in us that shouldn't be the case. But the reality is, talking about payments is the only way that we're going to be able to solve pay inequity. And like for me, if I'm going into a job and I find out that and we're not talking about, if I find out that I'm making less than somebody else in the company, it makes you ask why and go to your boss. And the two options there are because, well, it's not justified, which should be fixed, or because it might be justified, but that gives me feedback on what I can improve upon. And like talking about having these conversations and looking at this spreadsheet, it's just phenomenal to be able to see like the discrepancies. I'm looking in DC and Baltimore because that's where I'm from. And I'm looking at the Roundhouse Theater Company, and there's two different scenic designers. One scenic designer made almost $6,000 and the other one made about $1,300. And what's the cause of that discrepancy? I also very much appreciate the many people that had included the operating budget for the entire company, because that is just also so much more telling about where this person's design fell when it came to the bottom line. And again, looking at the pay structure, being transparent about where money is going will only help us in the future figure out how we can be more equitable with our pay structures. Again, talking about raw material uses versus paying the design fee, like looking at how those numbers boil down, looking at, how much work is everyone putting into, again, will help say like, why is the show getting $50,000 worth of materials budget, but the designer's only getting $2,000 to design that show. And it goes up and down the board. I think as a non-design professional am looking at this excited to see more transparency, to say, where is this going? Why, like, advocating more if I'm going in as a manager into a company, advocating for my production team and advocating for the people that are working on the actual production, because they have just as much of a right to know where the money in the company is going. I can't tell you how frustrated I have been seeing how much money gets thrown at extra scenic pieces as a carpenter and still seeing my pay stub stay the same over 3 years. And
God knows that I always appreciate when, as a scenic designer, when the budget for the materials and the stipend of getting paid are like kind of comparable. And those numbers are super out of whack in either direction. It feels really weird.
Yeah. And I
Although
think,
it only ever goes one way.
yeah, I'd really like to see more transparency of salaries for those at the top, like artistic directors, because again, it's just like whispers, and then it creates sort of this divide among your production staff and your artistic staff and so on. And you hear rumors, you're like, well, so and so, is making a 6-figure salary, and it's like, I'm getting paid by the hour, and it's like,
And well, in both ways too.
Yeah.
I've certainly worked on a show once where I was like kind of grumpy about what I was getting paid, and then at one point I was like, oh, except like the staff are volunteers. Like I'm getting paid.
But again,
Theater's
should that
definitely
even
the
be the
worst.
case, though? Like, I think you can lump this in with the entire discussion of pay equity when it comes to apprenticeships and internships for summer stock theaters. It's not okay to be working in this industry and not being paid for the amount of work that you're doing. Especially, I know in one particular company that's being called out a lot is the Williamstown Theater Festival, which makes a lot of money, but is notorious for not paying and not housing its interns. And I think pay equity in this entire industry is being shown under a very bright light right now, because there are thousands and thousands of people right now that are without a job and living month to month off of food stamps and going to food banks and trying to rely on just barely making ends meet. But there are also many people in this industry that have been able to kick back and not really have to think about it at all.
I feel like as the pandemic has gone on, a lot of more people have started talking about theaters having a really people first focus when they come back, which leads nicely into our final article of this week. So this article is called "You Say You Want a Revolution" by Jim Warren, writing for AmericanTheater.org. He is advocating a people first model. He's an artistic director of a couple of theater companies, or he has guided a couple of theater companies over the course of his career. And what he's calling for has 3 basic tenets. He says, establish a company model instead of a bifurcation of staff or artistic contract players. So and there's a quote from him. He says, it simply doesn't make sense that we pay some folks year round, with most of them working 40 hours per week for a guaranteed 12-month salary and benefits, while the artists who create the work that drives our business are contract workers or gig workers. So instead of having people come in and out, you have people with you for a whole year, at least for a whole season. And then you'd find ways to use them when they were between shows. The same goes for actors. So the second tenet is commit to a 40-hour work week, 5-day work week, paid vacation and holidays or holiday equivalents for everybody, which is less than an equity week, right? An equity week is something like 48 hours. And it's hard to look at what we do as theater artists and say, we can do that with less time, right? But if you have more people, you have more support, you can do it with less time, and it's better for everybody to be able to do it with less time. You do better work when you're not working crazy hours for a whole week. The other way that plays out is, of course, you're going to have actors who are off for a show or are between shows if they're with you for a whole year, and you should use them for education. You should be doing outreach into other communities. You should be raising the next generation of theater lovers and theater makers. And then his third tenet is you should return to true rotating repertory of shows. So you have 3 or 4 shows going at the same time with scenery that can change out, that kind of thing. And all actors across the board should be paid the same.
Great Lakes Theater Company does exactly this.
I love it. I love it.
They have their company of actors who they will supplement for shows that they hire year round, because in the winter they come to Cleveland and do their shows in their home theater there. Then in the summer they take their shows out west to Boise and do it outdoors, like the same shows. So like they'll open shows in the spring in Cleveland and then take those shows out west and then open new shows start in the end of summer, going into fall, and then bring those into Cleveland. So like they have the same actors, they're always paid. It's always like, it's generally like the same design staff doing everything. So they kind of start to do that, which is really neat and really cool. And I would love to, but like they've had, you know, actors there in that company for 20 years. So
Well, and I
don't
think the
know
other
how
benefit of it is that, oh, sorry.
well, I was just going to say, like, I don't know, you know, you can get that into that model where it's like, how do you break into that group and into that kind of cohort?
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's one of those things that seems so healthy. And I think one of the other benefits of it is that a lot of the problems we have with theater and with accountability in theater, when you talk about things like harassment and discrimination, is that most people at any company are only there for a month or two, right? So if you're there for a whole year, then someone being difficult or unpleasant can't just get swept under the rug. You have to actually deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to see more theaters companies try this.
Plus, if they're doing shows in rep, and Great Lakes does that too, and they also have people like going around to the high schools in Ohio. Sorry, I really like that theater company. They have simpler sets because it needs to be, you know, taken down and a new one put up in a day, essentially, because they'll do one show Friday night, and then Saturday matinee will be that same show, and then evening will be the different show.
I don't know if anyone else is familiar with the Utah Shakespeare Festival, but I used to live down there and I would go see their shows because they had really inexpensive student passes, and they have an outdoor space that's replicated to kind of look like the globe. So it's got the stock set, sort of like it's set up, you know, in a very certain way so that you can only do so much, but I don't know, this could be a really great model going forward with COVID, right? Like, I understand weather permitting is a big issue, but I was thinking, I was like, I would feel comfortable going to see theater. I mean, if we were distanced enough outside in a space like that, because, you know, you have balconies, you have, it was a large house, and and they're trained and equipped to do changeovers between two shows on a day. So, you know, if they can do it, I don't see why we can't adopt a, you know, more economic model for theater, instead of one that just like throws money into the fire for these crazy things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know why it's just Shakespeare companies. I had this experience summer 2019 doing Michigan Shakespeare Festival, and it's great. You know, there's some real benefits to it, and I don't know what it would take to make the leap for more companies to do it year round and not just Shakespeare.
Well, I guess Shakespeare is public domain, so they don't have to pay for that.
Yeah, it is cheap.
How much money are we talking there, though?
Oh, for what?
For public domain. I think I don't know if it's enough to spin the Shakespeare industry.
You know, they might not be able to do first date all the time, but you know,
not with the lawsuit.
No. Maybe the Russian version. We don't know about that.
Yeah.
Gotta be hilarious if someone tried to do a sequel to the Russian version and then they had to sue us.
Payback.
Don't worry.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everybody for watching. This has been News from the Real World, and we'll see you next week. Sebastian.
Today